What does a massive missile attack on a capital city reveal about the current phase of the conflict? Is it primarily a military maneuver designed to degrade air defenses and logistics, or is it also a strategic message aimed at political leadership and international backers? And perhaps most importantly, how does an event like this alter calculations in Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, Brussels, and beyond? Today's analysis examines the most recent large-scale Russian missile assault on Kyiv, focusing not on rhetoric or speculation, but on verified developments, strategic context, and the broader geopolitical consequences. We will look closely at the military dimension, the civilian impact, the political responses, and the long-term implications for regional and global security. This is not only a story about explosions in one city, it is a window into the evolving dynamics of a war that has entered a protracted phase where missile barrages, drone swarms, and air defense systems have become central tools in a contest of endurance, deterrence, and strategic signaling. Let us begin with what happened and how we arrived at this moment. On the date in question, Russian forces launched a large-scale missile and drone strike targeting Kyiv and several other regions across Ukraine. According to Ukrainian officials, the attack involved a combination of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles. Air defense units were activated across the capital, intercepting a significant number of incoming projectiles. However, several missiles penetrated defenses, resulting in damage to residential buildings, infrastructure facilities, and industrial sites. Emergency services reported casualties among civilians as well as injuries to first responders. Power outages were recorded in certain districts, and debris from intercepted missiles caused additional structural damage. Ukrainian authorities described the assault as one of the most extensive attacks on Kyiv in recent months. Russia's Ministry of Defense stated that it had targeted military industrial facilities and command infrastructure, asserting that the strikes were aimed at degrading Ukraine's military capabilities. As in previous incidents, Moscow maintained that its targets were linked to defense production and logistics rather than civilian sites. To understand the significance of this event, it is essential to revisit the broader trajectory of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Kyiv has remained both a symbolic and strategic focal point. Early in the war, Russian forces advanced toward the capital but eventually withdrew, shifting focus to eastern and southern Ukraine. However, missile and drone attacks on Kyiv have continued throughout the conflict, particularly during periods of intensified fighting or political turning points. Missile campaigns have often coincided with key developments such as major Ukrainian offensives, new Western military aid packages, or diplomatic summits. These strikes serve multiple functions: testing air defense systems, pressuring civilian morale, signaling resolve, and attempting to disrupt logistics and command structures. Over the past year, the pattern of attacks has evolved. Russia has increasingly employed mixed barrages combining Iranian-designed drones, cruise missiles launched from aircraft or ships, and short-range ballistic missiles. This layered approach aims to overwhelm air defenses by presenting multiple simultaneous threats at varying altitudes and speeds. Meanwhile, Ukraine has significantly improved its air defense capabilities, receiving advanced systems from Western partners. These include surface-to-air missile systems designed to intercept both cruise and ballistic missiles. As a result, interception rates have reportedly increased in many instances, though no system guarantees complete protection. The recent attack on Kyiv appears to fit within this ongoing dynamic, an escalation in scale, possibly intended to degrade air defenses, stretch resources, and maintain pressure on the capital. But to fully grasp its implications, we must examine the military details more closely. The latest strike demonstrated a coordinated use of multiple weapons platforms. Ukrainian officials reported the launch of cruise missiles from strategic bombers operating over Russian territory, as well as missiles fired from naval vessels in the Black Sea. In addition, ballistic missiles were reportedly launched from ground-based systems, reducing warning time for defenders. The tactical logic behind such an approach is clear. Cruise missiles travel at lower altitudes and can maneuver, making them more difficult to detect early. Ballistic missiles, on the other hand, travel at much higher speeds and follow steep trajectories, complicating interception. When combined with waves of drones which may serve as decoys or reconnaissance tools, the objective is to saturate air defense networks. From a military standpoint, Kyiv represents more than a political capital. It is a hub for command and control, logistics coordination and defense industry activity. Targeting the city can serve both operational and psychological purposes. Even when air defenses intercept the majority of projectiles, the act of forcing continuous mobilization strains resources, increases maintenance demands, and consumes interceptor missiles that must be replenished. Ukraine's air defense network reportedly engaged dozens of incoming threats during the attack. Western-supplied systems have been integrated with older Soviet-era platforms, creating a layered defense architecture. However, the supply of interceptor missiles is finite. Each engagement involves a calculation, which targets pose the greatest risk, and how to allocate limited resources effectively. Russia's strategic objective in such strikes may include degrading Ukraine's defense industrial capacity, particularly facilities involved in drone production or weapons repair. Even partial damage can slow output and complicate logistics. At the same time, by continuing to target Kyiv, Moscow reinforces the message that no location within Ukraine is beyond reach. Official Russian statements framed the operation as a response to Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory and infrastructure. Ukrainian officials rejected this justification, emphasizing civilian casualties and damage to residential areas. The tactical significance of the strike also lies in its timing. Large-scale missile barrages often precede or coincide with intensified ground operations elsewhere along the front. By compelling Ukraine to divert attention and resources to air defense in the capital, Russia may seek to create localized advantages in contested regions. The political responses to the attack were swift. Ukrainian leadership condemned the strike as an act of deliberate terror against civilians. The president addressed the nation, reaffirming calls for additional air defense systems and accelerated delivery of interceptor missiles from Western partners. Russian officials maintained that the strikes were precision attacks on military-related targets. State media emphasized claims that defense industrial facilities had been successfully hit, portraying the operation as a legitimate military action within the context of ongoing hostilities. International reactions reflected existing alignments. Leaders in the European Union expressed solidarity with Ukraine and reiterated support for strengthening air defense capabilities. Several European governments announced plans to expedite military aid deliveries. In Washington, officials condemned the attack and underscored the importance of continued assistance to Kyiv. Debates over funding and long-term commitments have been ongoing, but large-scale strikes on civilian areas often influence political discourse, reinforcing arguments for sustained support. At the United Nations, calls for restraint and protection of civilians were reiterated. However, as in previous instances, diplomatic statements did not produce immediate changes on the ground. The political dimension of such attacks extends beyond immediate condemnations. Each large-scale strike tests the cohesion of Ukraine's international backers. Sustained support requires political will, financial resources, and public backing in donor countries. Missile attacks on Kyiv can galvanize sympathy, but they can also contribute to fatigue in societies facing economic pressures. The economic implications of a major missile strike are both direct and indirect. Direct damage includes destruction of residential property, commercial buildings, and infrastructure. Repair costs accumulate over time, placing additional strain on Ukraine's budget. Power outages and infrastructure disruptions can temporarily slow economic activity. While Ukraine has adapted to repeated attacks by decentralizing certain services and hardening infrastructure, the cumulative effect remains significant. Financial markets often react to large-scale strikes with short-term volatility, particularly in energy markets. Although Kyiv is not directly tied to global energy exports in the same way as Black Sea ports, any escalation raises broader concerns about regional stability. Energy infrastructure has been a recurring target in previous campaigns. Damage to substations or distribution networks can affect heating and electricity supply, especially during colder months. Ukraine has invested in protective measures and backup systems, but vulnerabilities persist. Sanctions remain a central economic factor in the broader conflict. Following major escalations, Western governments sometimes consider additional measures targeting Russian financial institutions, technology imports, or energy exports. However, the effectiveness and political feasibility of new sanctions depend on international coordination. The regional response to the missile attack reflects ongoing security concerns across Eastern Europe. NATO members bordering Ukraine have increased surveillance and air policing activities. Although the alliance is not directly involved in combat operations within Ukraine, it continues to provide training, intelligence support, and defensive equipment. The European Union reiterated commitments to financial assistance and reconstruction planning. At the same time, some member states face domestic debates over defense spending and energy diversification. Neighboring countries such as Poland and Romania monitor airspace closely during large-scale strikes, particularly when missiles or drones approach border regions. In previous incidents, debris or stray projectiles have crossed into neighboring territories, raising questions about escalation risks. Globally, reactions have varied. Some countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East have called for negotiations and de-escalation, emphasizing the economic impact of prolonged conflict on global food and energy prices. Others maintain a more neutral stance, balancing relations with both Moscow and Western capitals. The broader security implication is clear. Each large-scale attack reinforces the perception that the conflict remains volatile, with potential spillover risks. Beyond the immediate destruction and casualties, the strategic importance of a massive missile attack on Kyiv lies in what it signals about the war's trajectory. First, it underscores the centrality of long-range strike capabilities in modern warfare. The conflict has demonstrated how missiles and drones can shape strategic outcomes without necessarily altering frontline positions. The ability to project force deep into enemy territory complicates traditional notions of rear area safety. Second, the repeated targeting of Kyiv reinforces the capital's symbolic significance. Even if military objectives are limited, the act of striking a national capital carries political weight. It tests resilience, both domestic and international. Third, the attack highlights the growing importance of air defense systems. Countries observing the conflict are reassessing their own defensive capacities. The demand for advanced interception systems has increased globally, influencing procurement decisions and defense budgets. Fourth, the event contributes to the evolving balance between offense and defense. As interception technologies improve, attackers adapt with faster, more maneuverable missiles and larger drone swarms. This cycle of adaptation shapes military doctrines worldwide. Finally, the strike influences diplomatic calculations. A sustained campaign against urban centers can harden positions, making negotiations more difficult. Conversely, it may also create incentives for renewed diplomatic engagement if costs become unsustainable. A pathway toward de-escalation would require several conditions. First, both sides would need to perceive diminishing returns from continued large-scale strikes. If missile barrages fail to produce significant military gains and primarily generate international backlash, strategic incentives could shift. Second, diplomatic channels would need to remain open. Even limited agreements such as humanitarian corridors or restrictions on targeting energy infrastructure could serve as confidence-building measures. Third, external actors would play a critical role. Mediators acceptable to both parties could facilitate dialogue. Economic pressures, including sanctions and reconstruction costs, may also influence decision-making. However, barriers to peace remain substantial. Territorial disputes, security guarantees, and mutual distrust complicate negotiations. Domestic political considerations on both sides limit flexibility. A realistic assessment suggests that de-escalation would likely be gradual rather than immediate. Confidence-building steps could precede broader negotiations. Escalation could occur if missile strikes intensify in frequency or expand in geographic scope. A significant incident involving neighboring NATO territory, whether accidental or deliberate, could dramatically alter the conflict's parameters. Another trigger could be a major shift in military aid, such as the introduction of new long-range capabilities. If either side perceives a strategic disadvantage, it may respond with heightened force. Economic consequences of escalation would include increased energy market volatility and potential disruptions to trade routes. Defense spending would likely rise across Europe. Strategically, escalation risks entrenching a prolonged confrontation with limited prospects for near-term resolution. Both sides would calculate risks carefully, aware of the broader consequences. Over the long term, repeated large-scale strikes on Kyiv contribute to a reshaping of global security culture. Alliances may deepen, with greater emphasis on integrated air and missile defense. Defense industries in multiple countries are expanding production capacity to meet increased demand. Energy security strategies are evolving. European states have accelerated diversification efforts, reducing reliance on single suppliers. Infrastructure resilience, both physical and cyber, has become a strategic priority. Global trade patterns may adjust as companies reassess risk exposure in conflict-affected regions. Insurance costs for shipping and investment in Eastern Europe have fluctuated in response to security developments. Emerging powers observe the conflict closely, analyzing lessons for their own strategic planning. The interplay between sanctions, military aid, and domestic resilience offers insights into modern statecraft. The massive missile attack on Kyiv represents more than a single night of destruction. It encapsulates the evolving dynamics of a war defined by endurance, adaptation, and strategic signaling. Militarily, it highlights the contest between offensive missile capabilities and layered air defenses. Politically, it tests international resolve and domestic resilience. Economically, it adds to cumulative costs that will shape post-war recovery for years to come. Whether this event marks a turning point or another chapter in a protracted conflict depends on decisions yet to be made in Moscow, in Kyiv, and in capitals around the world. As this situation continues to unfold, two critical questions remain. Can sustained international support and defensive adaptation deter further large-scale strikes? And what combination of military pressure and diplomatic engagement might eventually create conditions for meaningful negotiations? We invite you to share your analysis in the comments respectfully and thoughtfully. In a conflict of this scale, informed discussion remains essential. Thank you for watching.